Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. My name is Greg. I am your host. This is the start of an all-new series of episodes unconnected to our first series. So if you have not yet heard our first 3 episodes on the Creole affair, you're not going to be missing any context if you don't go back and listen to those now. However, I would encourage you to go back and listen to those anyway. The subject I'm embarking on today is a monumental task. I am going to be attempting to explain to you the complicated series of events that led to the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, or the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In these first few episodes, I'm going to paint the context for you. I'm going to explain the Soviet political and economic system, as well as the Soviet history from the Russian Revolution up through the death of Stalin. And then the meat of our podcast is really going to focus on the late 1960s to the early 1990s. Once we get these first few episodes out of the way, the level of detail I'm going to give you about the events is going to greatly expand, and the level of ground we're covering in each episode is going to contract. So in these first few episodes, my plan is to give you the general context, because before you can understand how the Soviet Union collapsed, you first have to understand what the Soviet Union was. And that is what I'm going to attempt to explain to you in these first few episodes of this series. The decline and fall of the Soviet Union is a really complicated subject. There's a lot of moving parts. There was not just one thing that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were not just 2 or 3 things that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the confluence of many different problems: economic, political, social, you name it. It was the perfect storm of coinciding situations and crises that led to the decline and ultimately the collapse of this superpower. So strap yourselves in. This series will be long. I'm going to try and do it in short, digestible episodes. Get ready to take another journey with me as I embark on the decline and fall of the USSR. This is the end of history. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, President of the USSR, the first, last, and only man to hold that title, appeared on Soviet television to announce his resignation from that office. He held back strong emotions. This was a very emotional moment for him and for the country. His face, as always, remained serious and sober and unemotional. Yet his eyes gave away a kind of sadness, a kind of disappointment. Since assuming the role of General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March 1985, he had done everything in his power to set his country on a better path. And to be fair to Mikhail Gorbachev, he inherited a mess from his predecessors. Economic stagnation, chronic shortages, mounting budget deficits, an unpopular and some say unwinnable war in Afghanistan, and endemic corruption at every level of society. To meet this challenge, he embarked on bold reforms, unprecedented in the country's history, a program broadly known as perestroika. Perestroika is a Russian word that translates as the rebuilding or the reconstruction. Most commonly, it's translated as restructuring. It was an attempt to remake Soviet society to meet the challenges of a rapidly changing world. Though with these reforms, Gorbachev set out to save the Soviet Union, they only served to hasten its demise. Perestroika would attempt to completely rebuild and redefine the Soviet state in many spheres, both economic and political. But perestroika failed. In the end, rather than spill blood to preserve it, Gorbachev meekly stepped aside and allowed his country to disintegrate. When the speech was over, the red hammer and sickle flag of the USSR was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation raised in its place. The Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a superpower that played the largest role in defeating Nazi Germany and stood toe-to-toe with the United States throughout the Cold War, officially ceased to exist. In 1992, American author and philosopher Francis Fukuyama would hail the demise of the Soviet Union as the triumphant end of history. With the demise of Soviet communism, mankind had finally reached the pinnacle of its ideological development. Western liberal democracy would now become universal as the final form of human government. While some were more idealistic and optimistic than others, Fukuyama's theory was broadly shared by many in the West. With the United States now the world's sole remaining superpower, she and her Western European allies were now free to remake the world in their own image. I'm an American, and I'm a millennial. I was 2 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I don't remember it. I do remember growing up in suburban America in the 1990s, and this sense of optimism and, in hindsight, arrogance was everywhere. It's difficult to describe or put into words, but you felt it growing up and living in America during this time. It seemed to permeate the entire society until it was, to be honest, deeply shaken by the events of September 11th, 2001 and its aftermath. In Russia and other corners of the former Soviet Union, the collapse of the USSR was viewed through a very different lens. In 2006, Russian President Vladimir Putin would refer to the dissolution of the USSR as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. In sharp contrast to the arrogant optimism of my American childhood, the 1990s in Russia are largely remembered as a chaotic period of decline, hardship, and humiliation. Ordinary people in the former Soviet Union had no experience navigating a capitalist economy. Aid from the West that could have softened this transition was not forthcoming. Ordinary people suffered while gangsters and oligarchs became nauseatingly rich at their expense as their once proud country was laid low by economic depression and civil wars. In the East and the West, the perception of this event was like night and day. In this series, I will examine the decline and fall of the USSR. My hope is to shed light on this little understood and often misunderstood, especially by Westerners, piece of history. Before I can tell you how and why it fell apart, I will first need to explain to you what the Soviet Union was. Explaining what the Soviet Union was is a task that is easier said than done, especially to a Westerner, someone that doesn't have much experience with that system. Even for me, as someone who studied Russian history and culture in college and has spent time traveling throughout the former Soviet Union, as I dove into the research for this podcast and tried to really understand how things actually worked day to day in the government of the Soviet Union, it became terribly confusing. In the West, the Soviet Union is often referred to interchangeably with Russia, as though they are the same thing. It's important to know that they are not the same thing. While Russia was the center of power, and by far the largest of the Soviet republics, the Soviet Union was actually a union of 15 different constituent republics, all home to numerous nationalities, all with their own distinct language, culture, and history. The 15 republics were, and for the sake of clarity and brevity, I'm going to use the names of the modern countries rather than the official names of the former Soviet republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Now, a quick disclaimer. This podcast series is meant as an overview of the Soviet Union and its decline and fall, and not a comprehensive history of everything that happened in each of the 15 republics. I will do my best to tell the unique and distinct stories of what was happening in some of the constituent republics, but for the sake of brevity and clarity, I will be focusing mostly on events that were happening at the center of power of the USSR, in Russia. The capital of the USSR was in Moscow, and Russia was by far the largest of the republics. Many of the most important events in this story would be happening in Russia. Russia is also the country that I have the most knowledge of and experience with. I have visited a few former Soviet states, but I have lived and studied in Russia, and I have studied the Russian language. I will be looking in on important events in other republics from time to time, especially Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states, as some of the key events in this story took place in those countries. But my main point is, just because I'm going to talk a lot about Russia, you shouldn't think that during this time nothing important was happening in Azerbaijan or Tajikistan. It was. All of these countries and all of these peoples experience these events in their own way. I just don't have time to tell every single story. Just like when we study the American Revolution, we tend to focus heavily on events in Boston. That doesn't mean that nothing was happening in New Jersey or North Carolina. It was. Important things were happening in both of those colonies in the lead up to the American Revolution. We just focus on the events in Boston because that's where the events came to a head. And I will likewise be focusing largely on Russia in this story, not because nothing was happening in the other 14 republics, but because Russia was the center of power, and it's where the events of this story come to a head. I hope the stories I do tell will pique your curiosity and you will be interested to go learn more about this story. Please engage with us on social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you haven't followed us or engaged with us on social media yet, I encourage you to do that and share what you know and what you learn as you do your own research about what was happening with the decline and fall of the Soviet Union in each of these constituent republics. I'm eager to have that conversation. I want the History Sphere to be a community where we can all learn together. The USSR was formed in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the ensuing Russian Civil War. I will cover these events briefly in the next episode, but as my focus in this podcast is on the end of the USSR and not the beginning, this will be a very brief overview. If you want a detailed look at the Russian Revolution, I suggest listening to Series 10 of Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, which covers the Russian Revolution in great detail. And I credit Mike Duncan and his podcasts for introducing me to the world of history podcasting. His History of Rome podcast was the first podcast I ever listened to from start to finish, and it got me addicted to history podcasts and largely inspired me to start this podcast. Mike Duncan's podcasts, both the History of Rome and Revolutions, to this day, in my opinion, are the gold standard of history podcasting. So if you like my podcast, you'll love his. I encourage you to go check it out. The USSR had 3 constitutions in its history. The 1924 Lenin Constitution, the 1936 Stalin Constitution, and the 1977 Brezhnev Constitution. The structure of the government and the state that I'm going to describe to you today is going to focus on the 1977 Brezhnev Constitution, because that is the constitution that was in effect when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. When you look at this constitution, what is remarkable, if you've never looked at the Soviet Constitution, on paper, the USSR was the freest, most democratic country in the history of the world. Everyone had the guaranteed right to a job, to housing, to health care, and to other economic and social rights. Also guaranteed in that constitution are the same civil and political rights broadly enjoyed in the United States and in other Western democracies, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, universal suffrage and the right to vote and elect your leaders, all of those rights that we think of as the fundamental civil and political rights in the United States were also guaranteed in the Constitution of the USSR. Unfortunately, for the people of the USSR, the Constitution did not actually accurately describe the way things work. As one observer would note, the Constitution of the USSR was a lie. The Soviet constitutions, all 3 of them, were written as aspirational documents. They were propaganda documents largely meant to convince outsiders that the USSR was truly the workers' paradise that it claimed to be. In reality, the USSR functioned as an authoritarian, one-party state. The Constitution did create an elected government that enjoyed de jure power, that is, the theoretical power of law. Some of it, at first glance, looks rather familiar to American observers and to other Western observers. The main legislative body of the Soviet Union was the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and the Supreme Soviet was made up of 2 chambers, a lower chamber and an upper chamber. The lower chamber was a chamber where representation from throughout the USSR was apportioned equally according to the population, very similar to how the U.S. House of Representatives operates, and this was called the Soviet of the Union. Then there was an upper chamber that apportioned equal representation to the constituent republics and other autonomous regions throughout the USSR, and this was called the Soviet of Nationalities, and it operated very similar to how you would think of the United States Senate, with equal representation from the states rather than apportioned according to population. This is where the similarities come to an end. Within the USSR, there were no separation of powers. All power flowed, theoretically at least, from the Supreme Soviet. The Supreme Soviet was not a standing body. The entire body only convened twice a year and only for a few days. The Supreme Soviet would come together to elect the Premier and the Presidium. Unlike the US, where the President is both head of state and head of government, in the USSR, these roles were separated. The Premier was elected as the head of government by the Supreme Soviet. He exercised the supreme executive functions over internal matters within the USSR. His most important role was in planning the economy, formulating the 5-year plans, and overseeing the administrative state that supervised the planned socialist economy of the USSR. The Presidium was a council also elected by the Supreme Soviet that acted as a collective head of state. The chairman of the Presidium commanded a great deal of respect and is often referred to as the head of state for the sake of simplicity, but that's not quite accurate. There was no individual head of state in the Soviet Union. The Presidium exercised this role collectively, with the chairman acting as a sort of first among equals. The Presidium was the face of the Soviet government to the outside world and exercised the powers of the Supreme Soviet when the full body was not in session, which was most of the time. Within the federal system of the USSR, the governments of the various constituent republics operated in more or less the same way. Each republic had its own Supreme Soviet, its own Premier, its own Presidium, etc. Representatives to the Supreme Soviet, Republic Soviets, and local Soviets were directly elected by a vote of the people. Candidates for office were pre-approved and nominated by the Communist Party, and they ran unopposed. The vast majority of candidates were themselves members of the Communist Party, but the party would put forward a few quote-unquote independent candidates for the sake of appearances. There were no other political parties allowed. Voters were given a ballot with a single name on it and had the opportunity to approve or disapprove the nomination of that candidate. To those of us from Western democracies like the United States, this probably sounds like an entirely pointless exercise, and for the most part it was. During the reign of Stalin, especially, these elections were purely for show, and voting not to approve the nominated candidate could be used as evidence of disloyalty to the party. Disloyalty to the party could result in imprisonment in a gulag or sometimes even execution. However, after the death of Stalin later on, there were occasions when these elections were something more than perfunctory. A candidate needed to get over 50% of the vote in order to be elected, and there were times, especially at the local level, where if a candidate was not delivering what the community wanted or needed, the people could band together, and did, to create enough support to deny that candidate election. If a candidate failed to receive 50% of the vote, he or she would either promise changes and resubmit themselves for another election, or sometimes the party would step in and just nominate a new candidate and hold a new election. The system was authoritarian and largely undemocratic, don't get me wrong, but there was just enough of a grain of democracy within that system, at least at the local level, that government officials could not entirely ignore the needs of their constituents and the will of the people. However, while this elected government, and I elected is in quotes, but the government was technically elected by a vote of the people, this elected government had de jure power, that is the power by law. The de facto power, that is the power in fact, was held by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which held a monopoly on power and allowed no other political parties. And this wasn't a secret. No one tried to hide this. In fact, the Constitution, the 1977 Constitution, states, quote, "The leading and guiding force of Soviet society and the nucleus of its political system, of all state organizations and public organizations, is the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union exists for the people and serves the people. The Communist Party, armed with Marxism-Leninism, determines the general perspectives of the development of society and the course of the home and foreign policy of the USSR, directs the great constructive work of the Soviet people, and imparts a planned, systematic, and theoretically substantiated character to their struggle for the victory of communism." End quote. Since the Communist Party, both in law and fact, completely dominated the government, whoever was in charge of the party was the real power in the government, and that was the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Under the Constitution, the leaders of the USSR were the Premier and the members of the Presidium, but they were all members of the Communist Party, as were the vast majority of legislators who elected them. And as members of the Communist Party, they took their marching orders from the General Secretary. The General Secretary was the leader of the Communist Party and had the power to grant membership and expel members from the party. Every party member, including government officials, owed their position in the party and in society to the General Secretary. The General Secretary would sometimes hold official offices in government as well, either Premier or Chairman of the Presidium. Whether or not he held an official government post, though, the General Secretary was the real leader of the Soviet Union. I think there's a fair comparison to be made for those of you who are interested in Roman history to the government of the Roman Empire under the Principate of Augustus. After the fall of the Republic, the Senate still met and debated, consuls were still elected annually, and they held the power by law within the Roman quote-unquote Republic. Sometimes the emperor would stand for election and serve as consul, sometimes he wouldn't. But whether the emperor was consul or not, the emperor held the actual authority in the Roman Empire. It was the same with the Soviet Union and the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Whether he was currently serving as Premier or Chairman of the Presidium or in some other government post, he was the real leader of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party operated as a kind of parallel state to the official government. Every organ of the official government, which in the Soviet socialist state encompassed basically every aspect of daily life, had a Communist Party official to oversee it. The party was everywhere. It was omnipresent in the lives of Soviet citizens. And this brings me to the final point that I want to cover today in this introduction: the absolute nauseating bureaucracy that was the bread and butter of the Soviet system. The USSR had a state-owned command economy. The government would formulate 5-year plans for economic development from the very top, and then would delegate the task down of carrying out their plans for the economy in a vast pyramid-shaped bureaucracy of the Communist Party. The 5-year plan would be formulated by top officials of the Communist Party and then officially proposed by the Premier to the Supreme Soviet, which would always approve it and delegate the task of carrying it out to the various ministries responsible for aspects of the Soviet economy, overseen at every level by a Communist Party official or a group of Communist Party officials. There were several problems inherent in this system of planned economics. Those making plans at the very top usually did not have a complex understanding of the situation on the ground in the various spheres of the economy that they were planning. The authoritarian nature of the system meant that failure to meet the benchmarks of the 5-year plans could be severely punished, and blame would always be passed down to the people at the lower levels. Those at the higher levels would pass the buck and blame the person below them, so it was the people at the very bottom of this pyramid of bureaucracy that suffered if the 5-year plan benchmarks were not met. I think it might be helpful to look at an example of what this system could actually look like in practice. The Supreme Soviet approves a 5-year plan that calls for the construction of a nuclear power plant to provide electricity to the surrounding areas. The resources to accomplish this are limited, and local officials know the blame will fall on them if they fail to meet the demands of the plan. The party officials responsible for overseeing the construction, not wanting to be held responsible for failure, rushed the project forward, cutting corners in both the quality of construction materials used and in safety controls. The power plant subsequently fails 2 safety tests conducted by impartial experts. With the deadline closing in, local party officials used their authority to push through the approval for the plant to become operational, deeming it safe even though the actual experts have not given it the green light. I have just summarized in a very basic way the process that led to the construction of the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl. I will cover the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in detail in a later episode, as it is a very important chapter in this overall story. For now, I will just say that this shoddy construction process, along with other design flaws in the plant that were not foreseen, would lead to the worst nuclear disaster in world history, and lay bare the inherent flaws in this Soviet system. An individual living in this system in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the height of the Brezhnev era, encountered the state and party bureaucracy in almost every aspect of their lives. A hypothetical Soviet man would wake up in the morning and, as he eats breakfast, he might read the Communist Party newspaper, Pravda, a Russian word meaning the truth. He would then go to work at a state-run factory or a state-run collective farm where his work would be overseen not only by his regular professional boss or supervisor, but also by a Communist Party official or a committee of Communist Party officials responsible for whichever aspect of the Soviet economy he was working in. On his way home, he might stop by the Universam, the state-run grocery store, to pick up some essentials. The products on the shelves were all produced by state-run entities, and the grocery store employees were overseen by party officials and bureaucrats just like him. He would then return home to his apartment, owned and provided to him by the state, in a building overseen by a Communist Party community organization. He might decide to watch some television before bed. The standard of living in the USSR had been improving during these years, and an increasing number of households had a television. On TV, he might watch state-run evening news, where every story he heard was pre-approved by party censors and filtered through the lens of the party's official ideology. Most Russians, in my experience, who lived through this time period remember it quite fondly as a time when there was stabilnosti, or stability. The standard of living was lower than in Western countries, but people generally had everything they needed. There was enough to eat, they had a place to live, they had a job, there was social security. Gone were the days of Stalin's terror. While the system remained an authoritarian one that tolerated little or no dissent from official ideology, if you minded your own business and stayed away from politics, life was usually pretty normal, and for many people, quite enjoyable. This economic stability, however, like the political system of the Soviet Union, was all built on a lie. Ordinary Soviet citizens would find out before the leadership of the Soviet Union, who were late to the party, that even though they were insulated in this socialist planned economy, the things that were happening outside the Soviet Union in the global market still affected them. And as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the cracks in the foundation of this economic system would begin to show. And as the economy started to crumble, the political system started to crumble along with it, as people lost faith in the political system as they were suffering economically. And so in the mid-1980s, the need for reform was apparent to everybody. And in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and embarked on a series of great reforms called Perestroika, as we talked about in the beginning of this episode, to attempt to save the Soviet Union. That is where I'm going to leave things for today. As always, thank you for listening. I want to give a big thank you and shout out to the Blake Annex for providing me with the studio I am using to record this podcast. If you haven't yet followed us on social media, I encourage you to do that for regular updates about the show and to engage with us with any questions you have. I will do my best to respond to people on social media and answer any questions you have. I'm looking forward to taking this new journey with you. This is going to be a lot of fun. Next time on the History Sphere, I will begin setting the stage and the context for our main event by giving a brief overview of the Russian Revolution and the rise to power of Joseph Stalin. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.